All right, this morning we're shifting gears in our survey. We just finished the book of Jude last week, and obviously the next book is Revelation. There's too much in Revelation to finish in this trimester, so that's for next trimester, which begins in September. So we're making our way through some of the minor prophets. We have to bring some of the Old Testament, as we've already done with Daniel, bring some of the Old Testament to Sunday morning to finish up. And so we'll finish up in a staggered manner next year. By staggered, I mean because we took a trimester off for the hermeneutics class, we're going to be one trimester off finishing up. But next year we finish up the survey. We're ready for the book of Hosea, chapters 1 to 5. Let's give some introductory information to Hosea and to the minor prophets in general. Let's talk about Hosea the man. What do we know about Hosea? Question 1. All right. His name means the same as Joshua and Jesus. Both of those names mean salvation or Savior. Salvation is of God. It also carries the connotation of help. And so there is a significance to his name. What else do we know about it? All right. He's to take a wife of harlotry, a wife of whoredom. And that he does. Her name was Gomer. And he has how many children? 3 that are revealed here in the text. 2 sons and a daughter. A son, a daughter, and a son. We'll identify them here in just a moment. His home seems to be in the north. He's seemingly a native of the north. We don't have a great deal of information about that, except the implications of the text. She seems to show some sympathy for the north. I don't mean sympathy because they're in sin, but that he's concerned and he cares. And so most have concluded that he was probably a native of the north, perhaps Samaria. And there is some perhaps there that we emphasize. We know little or nothing about any occupation. That is, was he like a sheep herder, or was he whatever it is that he may have had as another occupation, as well as being a prophet. But he may have been of the priestly order. There's some slight implications of that through the text. And again, I say perhaps with reference to that. Concerning his marriage, he had a wife named Gomer. He was directed by God to go marry a wife of whoredom, a wife of adultery, that is, who was committing adultery. But it was more than just adultery, but it was whoredom, which has to do with the degree and the degradation of the sin that we'll talk about here in just a moment. And then after he marries her, she goes after her many lovers. She bears him 3 children that we'll identify in chapter 1. So that's something we know about the family. That family circumstance serves as a parallel to what's going on with reference to the nation of Israel, the northern kingdom, that they've gone after whoredom. These children represent some message with reference to the northern kingdom of Israel. Let's go to question number 2. To whom is Hosea's prophecy directed? You have 2 choices. Israel, the northern kingdom. And we'll get more to that here in just a moment. Let's give some background to this circumstance of the book. The political background starts with Jeroboam II. We'll talk about that king in Israel in just a moment, and goes through several kings in Judah. And so there's a period of time, perhaps 25 years, some say 10, but others say maybe longer than that. But be that as it may, it began in the days of prosperity, but before he gets through, here is a nation that's struggling for survival. By the time, just shortly after his prophecy is through and done, the nation goes into Assyrian captivity. So here is a nation that starts in prosperity when he begins to prophesy and then ends in ruin. And so the political circumstance is going downhill. Socially, what's going on with reference to the nation of Israel? The nation is in moral decay, is indicated in chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. They are in moral ruin. And so Politically, it's going downhill. Morally, it's going downhill. And furthermore, religiously, they are in whoredom. Now, notice the description again, and I want to emphasize this. You say, well, that's like they're committing adultery. Picture yourself, if your mate commits adultery, that's bad enough. But what if your mate becomes a prostitute? That's even worse. You say, well, that's adultery. Yes, it is adultery, but that's even worse. It's a greater insult against you, and furthermore, it's further degrading, further going down in the depths of sin. And so that's what God pictures is what's going on with reference to Israel. They're in spiritual whoredom. They've gone after their gods and their lovers. Question number 3, when did he prophesy? If you don't have an answer to that, you can read, look at the board, and your answer is about 750 BC to about 725 BC. Is generally the time frame given, but starting around 750 BC. So he would have been just a little earlier than Isaiah. And we'll talk about Isaiah in just a moment and his connection. Now let's talk about the purpose of the book. Question number 4, what's the message of the book? Say again. Destruction of Israel. All right. What else? The righteousness of Jehovah. All right. Similar to other prophets. Chapter 1 verse 4 indicates, those are all good answers, he warns of the idolatry and immorality and pictures it in parallel to what Hosea is experiencing in his family. In other words, Hosea, if you understand what it's like to have a wife who's gone after whoredom, you understand what I'm dealing with and what you're helping me deal with in the nation of Israel. But secondly, it shows God's love for his wayward people. Let's go to chapter 11 and in verse 8, just as a sampling of this. 11 and in verse 8, he said, how can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? In other words, just like Hosea goes and rescues his wife and buys her off the slave block. So God's saying, I'm willing to pay the price to get you back. I want you back. I love you. I care for you. Even though you've gone after whoredom, I want you back. And so here's a message of God's love for his wayward people. Now, one of the things we've been pointing out in the prophets as we've gone through Ezekiel, some get discouraged. It's prophecies of doom, and it's the same message. This nation is doomed, this nation is doomed, this nation is doomed, Judah is doomed. They've sinned and they're facing punishment, same thing over and over and over and over. Yet in the middle of all of that, every prophet, including Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, they all talk about God's love and God's mercy. We're going to see the Messiah introduced to us in chapter 1, and we'll see more about that as we go along. Robinson, that's not A.T. Robertson, but Robinson in his work on the Minor Prophets said, God's loving faithfulness and Israel's thankless unfaithfulness summarizes the book. And I say amen to that. Well, what do we know about the nature and the style of the book? As you've read through it, what's your impression of the nature of the book? One of the things to me is the colorful descriptions of sin and the consequence. It's one thing to say you've gone after your idols and you're facing doom and destruction. But yet I love you and I'm willing to bring you back. But what a colorful description to say that Hosea, take a wife of whoredom, and then she goes after her lovers, and then he goes and buys her back. What a colorful description of God's love, and other descriptions that we're going to get through. But also, it's almost as if each verse, not literally every verse, but several verses become a sermon of its own. Let me give you an example of that. Look at chapter 4 and in verse 6. This is a sermon within itself. My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. Just take that verse and we could talk about that for the rest of the class. We've got a sermon right there. Look at chapter 4, verse 16. Israel's like a stubborn calf. Look at verse 17. Ephraim is joined to his idols. Let him alone. Chapter 6 and in verse 6. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Those are sermons within themselves. One writer says that the prophet is a blend of sob and sermon, more sob than there is sermon. And I agree with that. All right, let's talk about the time frame where he fits in, and then we'll get underway making our scan through these 5 chapters as best we can. This is one of the best timetables with reference to the kings. And right here at the beginning is the United Kingdom, and then here's where the kingdom splits, and here we have the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, that's the beginning of it. Let's fast forward a little bit. We're starting right here with Jeroboam the second, Jeroboam B, as we often refer to him. He's identified. In fact, all these kings that are highlighted are mentioned in verse 1. So here we have Hosea where he fits in during this time period. He was prophesying to the north. So that makes him a contemporary with such prophets as Isaiah and Micah, who were prophesying to the south. So we've already studied Isaiah, but about the same time that Isaiah comes just a little bit later. And Isaiah starts prophesying just after this, and so he's a contemporary with Isaiah. Micah is also in the south, but Amos is also preaching in the north. And he's also a contemporary with those 3 prophets. So this is the time period. So to get a kind of a glimpse of where we're going, see, back up just a little bit, we have Hezekiah, then Manasseh, then we have the rest of these kings, and then we have the southern kingdom go into captivity. But backing up again, it was not long after he finishes his prophecy that the northern kingdom goes into Assyrian captivity. So that gives us a little time frame with reference to this prophet and how he's prophesying. Now you're going to see this time and again as we go through the minor prophets. And here's the value of this. We classify the prophets by the kingdom and by the period. And these are only the minor prophets. We don't have the major prophets. Why do we call them minor prophets, by the way?
The size of the book is small.
Yeah, the size of the book. Not the impact of the prophet or the importance of the prophet. It's the size of the book. Isaiah is a bigger book. So is Ezekiel, a bigger book. Those are major prophets. So we have 12 minor prophets, and all 12 are up here. And so Hosea is right up here to the north. So we have the northern kingdom. Here we have the United Kingdom, and now the period of the divided kingdom. Hosea, Jonah, and Amos, those 3 are to the north. They are pre-exile prophets. Now, we don't have any exile prophets in the minor prophets, but we do have exile prophets like, you ought to get this one, Ezekiel and Daniel. And then we have post-exile prophets like Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And then you have prophets to the south like Joel and Obadiah and Micah and Nahum and Habakkuk and Zephaniah. So you have 6 of them are to the south, 3 of them to the north, and then 3 are over here in post-exile period. So to keep things fresh in our minds and organized in our minds, we classify them by the nation. He's to the northern kingdom. He was a pre-exile prophet. Make sense? That's where he fits, and those kings that we just mentioned. All right. Now let's get underway looking at the book, and so we're going to have to work our way through this in the time that we have. Here's what the book of Hosea is about. It's Israel's adultery illustrated by Hosea and Gomer, chapters 1 to 3. We'll get the details of that in a moment. 4 to 13 deals with the inevitable doom because of their harlotry, spiritual harlotry, their idolatry. So here's their guilt, their doom, etc. And then there's the restoration and pardon in chapter 14. And so we'll get to all of that a little bit later. Here's the breakdown of the first 5 chapters. We're going to look at more breakdown of this. Hosea takes a wife, and it's focusing on the doom and the hope of Israel. There's doom, but there's also hope. And then we're going to see she goes to whoredom. The whoredom of God's people is what's being depicted. And then we're going to see Hosea buys her back, chapter 3. Chapter 4, by the way, chapter 3 is a very short chapter. Chapter 4 is the charge. Here's the sins against Israel, and then here's the judgment that's due. Make sense? All right, let's go to chapter 1. Here's chapter 1. Let's see if we can make our way through chapter 1. Starting at verse 2, the Lord said to him, "Go take a wife of harlotry." Now, there's some question, was she a harlot when he goes to get this wife and find a wife and marries her? Or was it that he finds a wife, and I take that to be the case, by the way, but some think maybe that she was not a harlot and she became a harlot later so that it's more perfectly parallel to what God's trying to parallel. I'm not sure, but I think that she probably was a harlot. And since God's people have already become harlots spiritually, go get you a wife that is prone to harlotry, and we're going to illustrate the point. That may be what's going on, but be that as it may. Verse 2 gives me the implication of what this book is about. What do you learn at verse 2? If you had a friend beside you who said, I don't understand what the book is about, point to them in verse 2. Tell me what you would tell them. What does verse 2 say that this book is all about? Yeah. Israel has departed from God in harlotry. Now, were they committing literal harlotry? Yes. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about spiritual harlotry. That they have betrayed God and gone after other lovers when they went after their idols. That's his point. So he went and took Gomer, and she conceived and bore him a son. So we have him married to this wife. All right, let's talk about these three sons. So here's Hosea's family, verses 1 to 9. Took a wife of whoredom, and then here's his three children. The first is a son named Jezreel. And what does that name mean? God will scatter. Now, names were significant. So it's not just a name. I like the name Jezreel. We name kids because we like the sound of the name most of the time and without reference to the meaning. But here, you are to name this child, the son Jezreel, because there is significance to the meaning. Because what God's going to do to the nation of Israel is he's going to do what? He's going to scatter them. Now, case in point, he said, what's he going to do? To the house of whom? I'll punish the house of Jehu. Jehu was one of the kings in Israel earlier. And 2 Kings chapter 10 and in verse 31 tells us that Israel went downhill. I'm paraphrasing 10:31. 2 Kings 10:31. That the nation of Israel went down the tubes, partially because here was a king that did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam. Jeroboam started them in that direction, and here's a king that carries them even further. Kind of like some of our leaders. You can't blame any current president for the turmoil of our nation. They're just carrying it further where somebody started years ago. Makes sense? Going on with reference to Israel. All right, I'm going to scatter them. She now has a daughter. What's her name? Lo-Ruhamah. Lo means not. Ruhamah means, all right, no pity or mercy. And so, no mercy. The name means simply no mercy. So God says, I'm going to show no mercy to whom? Israel, the nation of Israel. But he would show mercy to Judah. Now, Judah ultimately goes into captivity. So why? What's the distinction here? And there's some question about that. I don't know all that's involved. I think I know part of what's involved at least. Or maybe it's a combination of them all. One is the nation of Israel had no good kings. Did they have any good kings in the south? Sure. Yeah, they had some good kings. So the nation lasted a little bit longer, but it finally went into captivity because they committed the same sin. So it may have to do with he spared them from Assyria. I'm going to list three possibilities. That he spared them from Assyria, but they finally faced doom later. But he spared them from Assyria attack. Secondly, a remnant's going to come back, and so that may mean the idea of mercy. But also, it was through Judah, the southern kingdom, through which the Messiah came. And so those may be the possibilities that I will have mercy on Judah, but I'm not having mercy on Israel. Then when she weaned the daughter, she has another son now, the third child. What's that name mean? Not my people. Lo-Ami. Lo meaning not, and not my people. So what does that mean with reference to Israel? God's saying, I'm not going to be your God and you're not going to be my people. I'm disowning you. Does that make sense? So these names are significant. Hosea, go get you a wife of whoredom. That's going to demonstrate the whoredom of God's people. You're going to have three children. The first child, the name signifies I'm going to scatter the people. Secondly, I'm not going to have mercy on them anymore. And thirdly, that they're not going to be my people anymore. Now let's get this last section here, the future hope, verses 10 and 11. You might write out to the side, this is messianic. And when you raise the question, how do I know? You tell me.
Speaking of the sands of the sea, whenever God made a promise to Abraham, that was one of his promises that God would multiply through Abraham.
Okay.
Multiply all humankind.
All right. So there is that promise. There's something else that I can know. I mean, there's sometimes I may look at it and I say, I think this is probably talking about the Messiah. I know this is talking about the Messiah. I know. I absolutely know. Quoted in Romans 9, verses 25 and 26, and applied to the Messianic age. So when inspiration uses it and applies it, I know. I absolutely know. Not because I'm smart, it's because I can read what Paul wrote. So Romans 9 interprets this as applying to the day of the Messiah. So let's quickly get that because I want to get to the other chapters. Though the children of Israel be as the sand of the sea, it'll come to pass, they'll say to them, you are not my people. And there it shall be said to them, you are the sons of the living God, and the children of Judah shall be gathered together. In other words, here's future hope. Even though we just saw in verses 1 to 9 the rejection of God's people, there is future hope in the Messiah. This is, let me stop and footnote here. This is often a tool used by the prophets. They paint, remember we've talked about this multiple times, they paint a dark, it's like an artist painting a dark background of sin of the nation, and then growing out of that is this brighter future hope coming, and that's the Messiah. They do that often. Here's a case in point. There's future hope for the people, is what verses 10 and 11 is describing. Let's go to chapter 2 now. Hosea's wife goes after her lovers, and so does God's people go after their lovers. So she goes after whoredom, and God's people go after whoredom. So let's get chapter 2 now. Verses 1 to 5, it says, say to your brethren and to your sisters, mercy is shown. Bring charges, verse 2, against your mother, bring charges, for she is not my wife, and I'm not her husband. And let her put away her harlotries. Now we're going to get some of the details here, but what I want you to see is the parallel that's drawn that his wife went after her lovers. She left him and went after all of her lovers. And so just like Israel has done the same thing. Now notice that here's what she's done. Here's spiritual adultery. Let her put away her harlotries and her adulteries. Verse 3, when God said, I'm going to strip her and expose her, strip her naked and expose her, what's he describing? I'm going to do what? I'm going to embarrass her. I'm going to humiliate her. I'm going to bring this nation and humiliate her. All right. 4, these children are the children of harlotry, and their mother has played the harlot. Verse 4. This is what she's done. Now, notice at verse 5, what does she do? She says she has got blank from blank. What's she saying? Yeah. All that I have and how I've been blessed, how I've been enriched, came from my lovers. Was that true? No. Came from her husband. But she credits her lovers with giving her all that she has. And so she's claiming that her blessings came from her lovers. Now let's start at verse 6. I think the point God's making here is I'm going to make her realize the situation that she's in. Because I'm going to hedge up her way, verse 6, and and wall her in, and she'll chase for her lovers, and she can't overtake them. And then what verse 7 is going to happen? She's going to come running back to her husband. Because, look at verse 8, for she did not know that I gave her the grain and the wine and the oil, multiplied her silver and gold. I gave her all of that. It wasn't her lovers that gave. I gave her all of that. I gave her all of that. I'm going to make her realize that. Now, starting at verse 9, what's God going to do to her? I'm going to take back the blessings. I'm going to take away the wine and the grain, etc. And I'm going to uncover her lewdness, And in other words, I'm going to bring punishment upon her. Look at verse 13. I will punish her for the days of Baals to which she burned incense. I'm going to punish her. So she went after her whoredom, and I'm going to make her realize she didn't get all of her blessings from them. She's going to go looking for them and can't find them, and they're going to be done. And as often is the case with whoredom, they're done and finished, and she's going to come running back. And when she does, then I'm going to punish. I'm going to punish her for what's going on. Now look at verse 14 to 23. Here's a picture of mercy. That I will allure her and bring her from the wilderness, verse 14 says, and I will give her vineyards from there and the valley of Achor, that's valley of trouble. What am I looking for? Verse 17 and 18. I take 17, 18, and into 19 to be messianic. A reference to brighter days in the Messiah. That there's coming a time when God's going to bless. There's coming a time when the war will cease. And I'm looking at verse 19. Yes, I will betroth you in righteousness and justice and loving kindness and mercy. I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord. I take that to be ultimately in the day of the Messiah. Again, I might cite Romans 9, 10, and 11. Now, and so you say, what evidence do you have of that? Well, verse 23 basically is the same concept that we saw in chapter 1 that's quoted in Romans 9, 25, and 26. It tells me that this probably is messianic. Does that make sense? That those who are not my people that I've rejected, I'll make them my people. And even Gentiles would be included in that. That's what I'm wanting you to see. All right. Questions on chapter 2. I know that's a hurried look. We've got 5 chapters to get through. This is a survey, so we're trying to get through the 5 chapters. Hosea takes a wife, has 3 children, and then there's the messianic prophecy. Now we have in chapter 2, she goes after whoredom. They went after whoredom. I'm going to make her realize her circumstance. I'm going to punish her, and yet there's love and mercy God is showing. I love you, and I care for you, and there's brighter days ahead. All right. Questions, comments? Chapter 3 is only 5 verses, so let's go to chapter 3, see what happens in these 5. That Hosea binds her back. I don't know of a better picture, except for the crucifixion, of God's love for his people than is described right here. Now you picture literally, here's a man who marries a wife. She chooses to go after her lover. She becomes a harlot. And she reaches the point that her lovers have nothing to do with her, and she's bought and sold as a slave now. He goes to the slave auction and sees her come across the block, and the bidding starts, and he starts bidding on her. And what does he give for her? How much? $15 shekels of silver and a homer and a half of barley. That's the price of a slave. That's also a year's salary for a priest. Now you stop and think about that. If he is of the priestly order, which some think that he was, he gave a year's salary to get back the woman who turned her back on him. You think about that. How many of us would say, if that were happening in our day, that, well, his wife took off and she went to some third world country, she became this harlot, and she got into slavery, and they were buying her and selling her, and he went over there and he gave a year's salary to buy her back. You'd think, I wouldn't have done that. I would have left her alone. I'd have let her rot in that country. Wouldn't you? Look at verse 1, I'm sorry. What do you learn from verse 3? What's the point of chapter 3? Say, well, he bought her back. No, that's not the point. What's the point?
That he still loved her, and God still loved him.
Yes. Yes. Look at verse 3. You might underline. He said, go again and love the woman you loved by a lover and is committing adultery, just like the love of the Lord for the children of Israel. See, you still love her, even though she's a harlot. And you buy her back. And that's just like the love I have for Israel. Yeah, well, yes, I'm hurt. I'm offended. And I'm done with Israel. That's true. But I still love them. And I'm reaching out to Israel. I want them to be saved. Does that make sense? And so he said, I bought her. And He told her she's not to play the harlot anymore. So now look at verse 4. What's verse 4 talking about? There are consequences to her harlotry, which is what? Read verse 4. If you don't have a clue, look at the screen and get a hint. Because of her harlotry, what's going to happen? You go into captivity. I think that's what he's talking about when he says at verse 4 that for the children of Israel shall abide many days without a king or a prince without sacrifice. What they're talking about. Without an ephod and teraphim. Those are things associated with the priesthood. In other words, there are times they're not going to be functioning as the priesthood. They're not going to be functioning at the temple because they're not going to have the temple. They're in captivity. So there's consequences to whoredom. But there's restoration, verse 5. There's a lot in 5 verses. I take this to be messianic. That after the children of Israel shall return. Remember, sometimes there can be a twofold fulfillment in the sense that the prophecy can have reference to them coming back into the land, and they did. And after the children of Israel shall return, coming back from the captivity, and seek the Lord their God, and David their king, and fear the Lord and his goodness in the latter days. I take that to be messianic. That ultimately God's love for Israel is fulfilled in the days of the Messiah. And you say, I'm impressed with this love that God had for the children of Israel. You're experiencing it right now. How so? How am I experiencing the love that he described here in chapter 3? How are you experiencing it? Absolutely. If you've been saved by the blood of Christ, you are the fulfillment of this love. That's what this is talking about. Verse 5. The day of the Messiah is coming. You benefit from that. All right, let's move on. That's chapters 1 to 3. Now, chapter 4 has to do with the charge against Israel. Kind of moved away now in chapters 4 and 5 from the parallel, because that parallel has been drawn. Your wife went after whoredom, you bought her back, etc. Now then, here's the charge against Israel. This is the northern kingdom. Now, what we have is two things. There's the rejection of God and his word, and then they turn to idols. Let's scan through verses 1 to 10. So we've got to try to get through 2 chapters here in the next few minutes. Let's see what we've got. At verse 1, at the end of verse, there was no truth or mercy or knowledge of God in the land. They've just rejected God. They've reached the point of rejecting God that there is bloodshed after bloodshed. In other words, blood runs after blood. How far do people go when they reject God? They'll do anything, even to the bloodshed is part of the point. Look at verse 6. My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. They've rejected God, and since they don't know, they've rejected. Look at the end of verse 6. Because they have forgotten the law of your God, I'll also forget your children. They've forgotten the law of God. Look at the end of verse 10. Because they have ceased obeying the Lord. So what is verses 1 to 10? I know that's a hurried look, but that gives a summary. Verses 1 to 10 said, here's the problem. You rejected your God, you forgot about God, and you've rejected his word. Just rejected that. You have no use for God. Is that true among us sometimes? Good point. Yeah, we're free moral agents. We have a choice. We can choose, and so if you reject, that's your choice. Good point. Start at verse 11 now through verse 19. Here's what they did because they rejected God. They turned after idols. Look at verse 12. We're going to hit the high points. Verse 12 mentions the wooden idols. Drop down to verse 15. This is interesting to me. Though Israel played the harlot, let not Judah offend. In other words, the point, if I might paraphrase, is Judah needs to be watching. See, Israel's just ahead of you, gone a little further than you have. You better be watching, pay attention. You follow in her path, you're going the same way. And she did. Verse 16, Israel's like a stubborn calf. Verse 17, if Ephraim is joined to his idols, let him alone. What does that mean? I know what it means, he's joined to his idols. But why does God say he's joined to his idols, let him alone? Yeah. There comes a time, someone may go into sin, but they're not joined to it. There's time you can bring them back. Israel's gone so far, if not at this point, there will soon be at that point where they're joined completely to their idols and just let them alone. Just turn away from them and just, I'm done with them. They're not my people. I'm rejecting them, and Assyria takes them. And just let him alone. Just let them go. All right. Let's move to chapter 5. Here's the final chapter. The judgment is due. 3 things we're going to see. Verses 1 to 7. Remember God said, I will scatter them? That's what he's doing right here. So first of all, he's saying, I'm going to withdraw from them. She's basically ripe for destruction. I want you to notice at look at verse 6. Is that the verse I'm looking for? They shall seek the Lord, but they will not find him. Yes, this is what I'm looking for. He has withdrawn himself from them. Verses 2, 3, 4, and 5, they've gone so far into sin they won't listen to God anymore. We don't have time to talk much about that. But I think verse 6 summarizes verses 1 to 7. They may come looking for me, which suggests hypocrisy. It's not sincerely. God's not saying they come to me in repentance and I'm going to say, no, I'm not interested. But what he's saying is they're going to feign coming to me. It's hypocrisy. They're not going to find me because I've withdrawn from them. I'm done. Let them alone. So what kind of punishment? God said, I'm going to withdraw from them. And I'm not going to be there to protect them. And I'm going to let Assyria take them. Look at verses 8 to 12. Verses 8 to 12, God's going to be like destruction to them. Look at verse 12. Therefore I will be to Ephraim like a moth, and to the house of Judah like rottenness. Moths destroy, and rottenness destroys. I'm going to be like destruction to them. I'm going to allow them to be destroyed. The nation's going to be crumbled. It's going to be gone. And by 722 BC, there is no Israel anymore. Boom, it's gone. And then verses 13 to 15, as our time is running close here, that he's saying that I'm going to take them away. Look at end of verse 14. I will take them away, and no one shall rescue. In other words, as we saw in Ezekiel, I'm going to do this to Israel, and nobody can stop me. There's not another nation. Egypt can't do it. Assyria is certainly not going to. Babylon can't stop me. It's going to happen. I'm taking them away. All right. Questions or comments? Yes, sir. Worldly wisdom. Good point. Good point. Questions, comments? Let's get 2 practical lessons real quick. Anybody? Good point. Do you ever, go ahead. Good point. Do you ever feel like, or maybe you've talked to someone who says, in connection with what Emily just said, that I have done so bad, I've committed so much sin, I just don't think God could forgive me. I think I'm hopeless. And yet I learned from this, you probably are not gone into harlotry and gone after many lovers, and God's buying you back off the auction block. And yet God's willing to do that. One more. Let's get one more practical lesson. Who's got one? Something you learned. Good note to end on. We'll stop right there. Start with chapter 6 next time.